So there's this thing with fonts where you have a line height. Basically, the difference between where the ascender and descenders, difference between those in points. This is getting a bit technical.
Welcome to Nerd Out at Spotify, where we bring you behind the curtain of the world's most popular audio streaming subscription service. Machine learning, open source, clouds, tabs versus spaces. We'll talk to Spotify engineers about interesting tech issues, big and small. I'm Dave Zolotusky, principal engineer at Spotify. Last year, Spotify made a huge update to our app, but probably not the one you're thinking of. It's a new typeface we call Spotify Mix. Most of us, we take changing fonts for granted, like selecting Helvetica or Times New Roman from a drop-down menu. It's really easy. But creating a new typeface and smoothly replacing the default across the entire Spotify ecosystem, that was a little more complex. Today, I'm going to talk with two people on Spotify's design platform team who helped bring Spotify Mix to the world. An iOS engineer working on Encore, our internal design system, and Spotify's first dedicated typographer. Hey guys, it's great to have you on. Can you just tell me a little bit about what you do at Spotify? What are your roles? Where are you based? All of that stuff.
Sure. So my name is Bianca. I'm a typographer. I work in Encore, which is Spotify's design system. I'm originally from Germany, which probably shines through a little bit. I think I joined like a little bit over 2 years ago now. And before Spotify, I was actually a typeface designer. So I actually made typefaces for bigger companies like Spotify. I'm very interested in this kind of like space between typography and type design and type technology. So I'm volunteering on the Web Fonts Working Group, W3C, and I'm involved in Unicode as well. That's me.
That sounds super interesting. I guess quickly, because we often talk to engineers or more kind of classic R&D roles. Can you tell me a little bit more about some of the roles and terms you use? Like I think you talked about being a typographer and being a typeface designer. What are these things? What are these roles? What do you guys do?
So as a typographer, I'm really mostly worried about the written word. So anything you can read on the Spotify app, I am interested in. If it's long form reading, if it's titles or anything like this, it's all evolving around text. And my background is in typeface design, which is the design of typefaces or fonts. And yeah, I used to draw a lot of letters. That's it.
Cool. No, that sounds super different from what we often talk about, but also super interesting. So Jesse, let's jump over to you. Tell me a little bit about yourself. What's your role at Spotify? How long have you been here? Where are you based? Tell me a little bit about yourself at Spotify.
Yeah, of course. So I'm Jesse. I'm an iOS engineer at Spotify. I'm based in the south of France, but originally grew up in the Netherlands. So kind of a strange accent, I guess. I've been with the company for 4 years now, and I've worked on Encore ever since. Working on Encore, the design system, and kind of nerding out on everything that's UI related and how to optimize that for iOS.
I see. So you both mentioned Encore, and then you just said it's a design system. So can you just tell me a little bit more about what Encore actually is?
You can, I think, see it as Lego bricks. So we design Lego bricks and build them for you so that you later on as an engineer, designer can put them together in different orders to build the UI interfaces that everyone is familiar with. And I think that's the most basic form of a design system. You tend to get a lot of guidelines as well on what kind of writing to use, like writing styles, voice, like terminology, and all of that comes tooled and bundled together so that you can easily start building features and you don't have to worry about all the details that go into building this UI components because you all get that for free. At Spotify, we are also particularly interested in accessibility. To provide accessibility out of the box by using our components, you get like color contrasting. We make sure that you adhere to the right accessibility guidelines, and all of that comes with the design system, and we try to bake that in directly into the product.
I see. So the design system, it's actual code and components and like a framework, or it's, I don't know, guidelines and documentation on how to do things?
All of the above. It's code, it's design, and it's documentation all bundled together. And that forms the product that we deliver as a design system to our users.
Encore is kind of like the home of reusable UI blocks so that Spotify looks and feels Spotify everywhere we use it. So we have lots of smaller bits in Foundation. So we are defining the color and the type, motion, and layout tokens. And then those are being used in components. And everyone who is designing for Spotify, for web or for mobile, iOS and Android, they are able to use these kind of blocks and build their products with it.
I got you. Yeah, that makes sense. I was trying to figure out if it's more of like guidelines or if it's something, I don't know, like Swift UI or something, like a drag and droppy sort of thing that lets you draw your app. And I guess it's kind of both of those, but also a much higher level thing where it's the components that make Spotify look and feel like Spotify, regardless of what page it is.
Exactly, yeah. And we have documentation, obviously. We have a site. And what you can find on there is design advice on like how should I use Encore if I'm designing something for Spotify, but then also code.
So why do companies do all this work to build a new font? Like, why would a company do this if their stuff's already working? Like, why not just do everything in some simple font that's everywhere? Like, why not just use Times New Roman?
Okay, well, there are several reasons why we would not or use Times New Roman. First of all, it was a typeface designed for newspapers, so it would absolutely have no place in an app like Spotify. There are bigger reasons for why brands would be interested in changing their default font like something that everyone is using. It's because to differentiate yourself. So if everyone used Times New Roman, then our app would look very similar to any in your banking app, and you wouldn't be able to have a big branding moment with having your own typeface and your own tone of voice. And I think like a typeface does change the way we communicate with our customers and clients. And if you are able to input into your own typeface, you can kind of like fine tune this tone of voice and make it really aligned with everything else that goes into a brand, like color and copywriting, for example.
Yeah, that's really interesting because I guess it's like a kind of a personality of the text, the same way that the color and things are. I know that makes a lot of sense.
There are other reasons as well. One of them is that you need to pay for licensing for a lot of fonts if you wanted to use them. There are free fonts out there, but with every free font, every other brand is using it. So if you want to stand out, you probably will go for a custom font or buy something off the shelf that is not used very often. But if you do that, if you buy something off the shelf from a type foundry, that means you will have to pay licensing on like an annual basis. And that can get quite expensive. So a lot of companies actually invest in having their own typeface made, which then also, they can influence what that will look like exactly.
You say type foundry?
A type foundry, yeah. It's basically a type manufacturer.
So it's like a place that creates fonts and you can license them from them, I guess?
Yeah, it's exactly that. The name foundry comes from, back in the days when we had metal type to typeset things. So it's still around. Everyone refers to people or companies that make type as type foundries.
Huh.
Only just occurred to me that this is a bit weird.
I had never heard that before, but that's cool. This is maybe a little bit off topic, but you mentioned kind of companies creating typefaces or fonts to really express their personality and some of the things you said. Are there any really famous examples of typefaces like that, of brands or things that we would think of almost because of their typeface?
I mean, yeah, think of the big brands. Think of Coca-Cola. You can't imagine a can of Coca-Cola without the Coca-Cola logo on it. It's very distinct and nobody else uses anything like it.
Yeah, I think Coca-Cola is a perfect example. That really makes the point. And there are probably dozens of other examples. So then let's get back to Spotify. What's our history with fonts here, and how do we get to where we are today with building our own font?
So I've only been here just over 2 years, but I know that before my time, we used Proxima Nova, which is an off-the-shelf font, but like a lot of companies are using that. And eventually, Spotify decided to move away from that font and go with almost like a mix between a custom font and an off-the-shelf font. So we licensed Circular, which is the font that we are still currently using for some of the languages. And Circular is a sans serif font, so it doesn't have serifs like Times New Roman. And we kind of customized it a little bit together with the foundry that we are licensing it from, and influenced things like the spacing between letters or the spacing between lines of text. So we have kind of like a modified version of an off-the-shelf font. And then in 2022, we started working together with another type foundry called Dynamo, and we started developing our own custom typeface, Spotify Mix. And we rolled this out this year for Latin languages, so, everything that uses the same kind of letters that you use in English. And for other languages, we are using still a mix of circular and fallback fonts for some other fonts.
You mentioned not having serifs. What does that even mean?
If you think of like a typeface that you would find in a book, you would have like little feet on some of those letters. They are sitting on the baseline where all the letters are sitting on. And if you think of, for example, the letter N, you have a stem on the left-hand side and then kind of like a shoulder and then another stem on the right-hand side. And on the bottom of those two stems, there are horizontal bits, like little feet. And those are serifs. And everything that doesn't have those kind of feet, we refer to as sans serif font, which is French. Right, Jesse? It means no serifs.
Exactly.
You talked about circular being the semi-off-the-shelf thing. So I guess Spotify had a somewhat custom font before now, and then now with Mix, it's a completely custom thing. What makes us decide that you said it was Proxima Nova, I guess, wasn't good enough and we need to customize things, but we don't need to go all the way to our own font, and then circular is kind of good enough and plus customization is good enough. And then at some point later deciding we need our whole new font. Like, what are the reasons for saying slightly custom, fully custom, just use off the shelf?
I think it all started as a brand exercise. We want to evolve as a brand and make us seem more special and more stand out, so that if you read like a big headline somewhere on Times Square without having to see Spotify, the logo, you might be able to guess this is Spotify, the brand, just by looking at the text. We really want to stand out among like all of the others. And I think that is the Spotify Mix era.
With Spotify, and I guess part of it's because I've worked at Spotify for so long, but I think with Spotify, for me, I've always felt like there's a lot of that already because of the way we do marketing and the way we do things like Wrapped and the way we talk about and structure things like our marketing and our billboards. To be that little bit more unique in a place where people can find you, that having the font do that, I think, is really interesting. So I guess let's jump into this actual Spotify Mix thing. So somewhere, somehow, we decide we need to make our own font. Then what?
So this was a brand decision. Brand and creative drove this, and they looped a bunch of other people in. So there were some people from Encore involved, me and my manager, Julie. And we also had some people from visual merchandising involved. They are the people responsible for things like playlist covers that you can see in the app every day, which also uses a lot of typography. So they had a big stake in this. And we all went to New York for a workshop together with the Type Foundry to establish what we are all trying to get out of this, because obviously brand has a little bit of a different approach than people who are concerned with UI. So for them, I think the emphasis was just like on bringing everyone together and making sure that we hear everyone out and see what kind of requirements everyone has, what kind of limitations everyone has, and then we find something that we can agree on. And we had really good workshops, and we tried to find out, what do we want this font to sound like? And we actually came back to circular a lot because we quite like it. We felt, it kind of like represents us really well. It looks friendly, it looks inviting. There's nothing angry about it, no kind of like spiky bits or anything. We liked a lot about it. We just didn't like that it wasn't as flexible as we wanted it to be. And we decided on the direction and then worked together with the Type Foundry to refine that over the next half year or so. And then we came out of it with a bunch of different iterations of the font. So we have a brand font that is slightly different from the UI font because a UI font has different needs. We are very much focused on functionality, whereas brand is very much focused on expression.
Maybe from Jesse's side, if you're working on Encore, if you're directly working on the iOS app and you start hearing like, there's going to be a whole new font, what's your response from a place of being an engineer in the design system? Like, what does that mean to you? I want to say what scares you about that, but maybe before getting into scaring you, what does that mean to you?
I was very excited about it because when I joined, we already had Circular in place. So when there's a new font coming around and you're able to work on it and try to figure out how are we going to ship this in the app, it's pretty exciting. And for me personally, it was a good time to start like digging into fonts, because I've been doing, I don't want to say basic iOS engineering,
If there is such a thing.
if there's such a thing, exactly. But I've never been so deep into fonts as I've been over the last year and a half, and I've learned so much. And I think one thing that stood out to me is how good a job Word has done over the years to like hide away all the complexity behind fonts. You get like the little drop down and you play around with choosing different fonts, and it all works out of the box, and it's so magical. And in the end, if you start digging into it a bit more, it's so complicated, and you kind of go into this rabbit hole of complexity, and you have to be careful not to dig yourself into a hole too deep. But it was very exciting, and I'm still excited about it.
So then I want to hear a little bit about the process of actually figuring out this font. I mean, I think Bianca said that there were many iterations, and there was this conversation with the Foundry and some kind of, I'm struggling to find a better word for it. I was going to say kind of circling around circular, but I don't ever want to be recorded saying it in that way. But then we actually ended up having to settle on what the font would be. And I'm assuming that both of your teams were involved in that, but in different ways, as there's probably like iOS and engineering-y and Encore things that impact what the font should look like, as well as just a lot of branding and typeface implications. So I'm curious kind of how we ended up with the font we did and what you love, but maybe also hate about where we landed.
So we had to make a few compromises when it came to the UI font. We couldn't just be like splashing out as much as brand does, because we need to be conscious of the performance implications of just like uploading a very heavy file. And with Spotify Mix, we introduced a lot more technological complexity. It's a variable font, and a variable font is basically a whole family of fonts inside a font. So when you previously had a light font and a bold font and a regular font of the same family, like Times New Roman, a variable font kind of like packages this all together into one font file. But you still have access to all of those weights and all of the steps that you don't have in between. So if you have a light font and a regular font, now you can have like something like a semi-light font. And for Spotify Mix, we not only have a weight axis, like the light to bold kind of situation, but we also have a width axis. So we can have like really narrow fonts or a really wide font. And then on top of that, there's also italics in there. And with the UI font, we had to make a lot of compromises where we just were conscious to not introduce too much complexity because of the file size. So we removed the slant axis, for example, and then we removed some extra characters that were in there that we didn't need, or extra numbers. And once we were like happy with the spec and the Foundry started delivering test files to us, we just like immediately involved all of the engineers and said, look, can you work with that? How is that going to look like?
What does it mean to have extra numbers in a font?
Okay, so we have some alternate characters in the brand version of the font. It's our like usual number set from 0 to 9, but we have 3 sets of those. This is just for like expressions. So if they have a campaign, or they can use it in rap, for example, so that you can just like introduce a little bit of an interesting element where some of the numbers look different from the standard set of numbers. And we don't have this in Encore. We don't ship those with Encore because it was just like an extra load in the file that we knew would be difficult to access in the app anyway. So we just removed those. And apart from the numbers, we have some other alternate characters as well. If you really closely look at Spotify Mix, you can see that the letters R, F, and T, the lowercase letters R, F, and T, have really spiky elements. So they go like really sharp. And we felt that, visual merchandising actually, they felt that this might not always be appropriate. And they had this example of a playlist that was specifically created when Queen Elizabeth II died. And they felt, if you have like these kind of like very distinct, sharp elements in there, it just like might be a little bit too aggressive for a playlist that reminds you of the death of your monarch.
I got you. Yes, that's interesting. As to your point of like how much a font says, if your font is very aggressive in the way that it's expressing something, there are scenarios where it's not the right font. So that's really interesting.
Yeah, and I think that there was one interesting step as well before, because we had circular SP. And so there's this thing with fonts where you have a line height. So that's basically the difference between where the ascender and descenders difference between those in points. This is getting a bit technical.
The line height is basically the distance from one line to the other. So if you have a baseline that all the letters are sitting on, and you have the first line with the first baseline of the first line of text, the distance from that one to the next baseline of the second line of text is the line height.
And so with Circular SP, initially we had different line heights. So we did a project before actually starting to integrate Spotify Mix to revamp those, because we had a few issues when it came to all the non-Latin scripts that we tried to align and iron out, and also to prepare for the new line height that was coming with Spotify Mix. And I think this also helped us to avoid like big visual difference when Spotify Mix actually came around. But I think that was one of our initial challenges that we had to tackle even before Spotify Mix was integrated into the app.
All right, so Jesse, I wasn't really close to this work when it was happening, but I've heard your name come up a lot as a real hero that made this work all get over the line. Can you just tell me more about what you did and what the parts of it that were on you were?
So over the years, you have multiple teams working on the app, and each of them is trying to render some text. And often they use like the default text component that's provided by Apple. But then there were also other attempts at design systems within Spotify. And so you have other text components. And we ended up with a bunch of them. I think that initially there were 20 different implementations used to render some text on screen. And then of those 20 instances, there were like multiple different usages across the app. And when I started working on Encore, one of the first things that we did was creating a new text component to rule them all. So we had that in place and it was working well. And we saw that it was solving localization issues where if you would mix Arabic with Latin scripts, initially you would have some clipping where some of the characters were cut off. Our new component was solving that. So before we started like rolling out Spotify Mix, we wanted to make sure that we have one centralized place where we were shipping out text and fonts. So we migrated all these different components into like our new Shiny component. And that has been like 8 months worth of work where teams helped us out. But I also did a lot of the migrations for the teams, but because they also have other things to work on that are higher priority, of course. And nobody wants to do a migration. So yeah, I ended up doing many of those. And I think that laid the groundwork of being able to successfully rolling out Spotify Mix without many UI bugs, I would say.
I'm used to software rollouts where you'll write a feature, you'll have an idea for how it feels, you'll write some unit tests, you'll do some local testing, you'll roll it out like an experiment, I don't know, slowly, more and more users. What do you do with a font? Like, how do you unit test it? How does Bianca's team know that the font is correct across the entire app? All of that.
Before we start to actually roll anything out to users, we do a lot of internal testing. So the first test we ran was really just a bunch of us that were involved in the project. And at that point, you basically have two sets of fonts within the app. On one hand, you have the Circular SP version, it's powering everyone. And then you have the new Shiny fonts. And I would say it's like as other features would test their new behaviors. Like we ran an A/B test, and it's if you have this flag on, load the Spotify Mix files, otherwise default to the previous fonts. So once we have that in place, we can just run the app and visually make sure that everything looks all right. And so we had a bunch of testing sessions where we went over very specific screens where we know that those are high impact screens. And we went over them, made sure that in different languages, but also in different accessibility text sizes, the app was still looking great with new fonts. And so once you do that, you get the first batch of bugs. And I remember one instance, you have an accessibility feature where you can use bold by default. So all text turns bold, and that was broken. So before you ship off like bugs to the entire company, or even worse, like the entire world, we made sure that we tested all these key surfaces out. And then we can also do unit tests for those fonts. So I delivered to Bianca a bunch of like snapshot tests, really, where you take a snapshot of a screen, piece of text with the different sizes of text in there. And I rendered that in different languages just to make sure that everything was looking great.
Yeah, I think the visual tests, they were quite interesting. So it was like a bunch of people, we just roped everyone in from the team, and everyone had their own devices. So we had different test sessions for Android, for iOS, and for web. And I remember I had to make like a visual cheat sheet because obviously not everyone is so used to looking at letters as I am. So I just needed to make sure that everyone can see the difference between Circular and Spotify Mix and can point out instances where, for example, Spotify Mix didn't load and Circular is still available, which is for us an indication that they are not using the latest component from us. So yeah, it was kind of fun.
Yep. Yeah, that's exactly the sort of thing that I was really interested in figuring out, because I guess you said you can write a unit test, but I assume you can test that like something rendered or didn't render. But when you get into things like what you were saying with something that can be bolded, you need to know that it's bolded and like the things fit on the screen correctly and didn't clip and did use the correct font. And I think Bianca said that Spotify Mix has many different weights. So like it's at the correct level of bolded instead of something off. Like, I don't know, it kind of blows my mind how you would figure out all of that correctly across all of our properties, like both mobile apps and web and, I don't know, every random TV app and every other thing.
Yeah, I think everyone's eyes on Encore are now like fine-tuned to Spotify Mix. They can see it everywhere.
And I think it's also one of those foundational pieces that we deliver through the design system. Like we define a subset of what we call text styles. So that's if you see a title, it will always be at, I'm going to say 48 points. And if you look at some body text, that's at 60 points. And that's always true. And then of course, the sizes change a bit for the different platforms. But when you reference like a body text style, it's always the same configuration independently of the platform. And that also helps us like make sure that it's consistent and spot those kind of differences. And you can actually go quite far with the unit tests. I have a file, and with the help of Bianca, I basically try to unit test which font would be loaded by the system for different languages. So we have a bunch of different languages, different scripts, and we know which fonts are used to render that. And you can do the same then in different configurations of like different boldness, like different weights, different widths, and make sure that it actually loads the correct font. So that's unit testing. And then you go level up where you do the same thing, but snapshot testing, where you take a screenshot and then make sure that visually looks good. And the next time you run the app, you do the same test and you can see that there's no differences. And so you go from like the very low level a step higher up. And then in the end, you go running the app and make sure that everything looks good. And of course, it won't be perfect everywhere because of all these different configurations. That's also a fact that you have to accept. But if the key surfaces look great and you try to provide the right guidelines to your users to actually build the UI, you actually are able to eliminate, I would say, 90% of the problems. And then you get into the realm of the very specific edge cases where you need to like look at the different ways to approach the problem.
That sounds like a really fun challenge, like a really interesting thing to go through. Were there particularly memorable points through the rollout, times where things either went far better or far worse than you expected?
I think we were like really lucky because we did this other piece of work in the run up to it. So we kind of tested the whole rollout procedure like in the beginning of the year, and then we did the rollout in late spring. So like with this work that we did about the line heights, we did the whole like A/B testing, employee testing, and all of those like metrics that we set up then. we could actually replicate later on for when we rolled out Spotify Mix. So that was a really good way of testing the process. And we felt like really confident in what we were doing by the time we arrived at rolling out Spotify Mix, I think.
Yeah, I specifically remember the moment that we finally finished all the work and the preparation that goes into this rollout. And we flipped the switch and now it's available for everyone. And it was kind of anticlimactic because we had all this build up and we've been working for months and months on this project. And then you flip on the switch and you're kind of expecting this to be a big bang because you have all this build up. You're so proud. And then it was just a smooth rollout and it wasn't disruptive. But at the same time, when you look back now on Wrapped, we get all this expressiveness. It's a major change in branding. And for the end users, it was just like a seamless transition. And I think that really shows off like also the power of a design system where you can just ship such a major change from a single point without any major disruption.
Honestly, we were all surprised by how smooth that went.
So that's great. It sounds like the rollout went super well and you made this really drastic change across the entire app and everything went smoothly and nothing broke. That's really rare. Thank you both for being on. This has been a lot of fun. Glad we could do this.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thank you as well, Dave.
Aside from Encore, what else are you nerding out about these days?
I'm starting to nerd out on fonts, to be honest. I've been in touch with Bianca so often now that I'm trying to push her to teach me like how to draw letters. And we actually had a very fun end of the year exercise where you come up with a recipe of how to draw a certain typeface and you have to draw a word. So I really enjoyed that and I want to go deeper into that. Now I'm watching Netflix shows and I'm like, oh, this is a cool typeface.
I'm converting them all outside of my job. I mean, it's winter in the UK. Everything is grey and barren. There's no leaves on the trees. But I always make my winters better by go bird watching. And I don't think I even admitted that to Jesse. So he might be surprised by this, by how boring I am in my private life. But yeah, that's it. I'm really enjoying some migrant birds over here on the British Isles.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to hit the follow button so you don't miss an episode. If you have any questions or feedback, email us at nerdout@spotify.com. Nerd Out at Spotify is produced by Spotify's Ted Vergakis and by Seaplane Armada, who wrote our extra bold theme song. I'm Dave Zolotusky. Thanks for nerding out with us. Always like a smooth rollout.